Oh, sometimes I think the only way to get rid of that kind of behavior is to get off social media, which unfortunately is difficult for us to do when we're trying to do our jobs. Um, there is a corner of the internet that really feels like sports is the province of men, and that anytime a woman is involved in it at all, or comments on it, or weighs in, or dares to have an opinion about it, is out there to shut the woman down. So, I laughed when I saw you say that. I tweeted that out because that's pretty much how I feel every single day. I'm surprised I actually put it into words at some point, but yeah, I mean, it makes your job more difficult. I always tell people, if you have teenagers, or your husband or whatever, like, just know what other people in your family do online. Like, I feel like for every guy out there who is always, correcting women or mansplaining or whatever, like, there is a wife or a mother somewhere who's like, should be like, what are you doing? And not that it's on women to police the internet, but at the same time, like, holding these guys accountable a little bit for the women in their lives, for the way they treat women online, would maybe help stem some of this. Anyone who has worked in this industry has seen the way that men are responded to online and the way that women are responded to online. And there are, plenty of, I've had situations where I'm covering a story, and the men that are covering the story are being left to go about their business. And the women that are covering the story are getting all kinds of blowback from fans who don't like what they're reporting. So, yeah, I mean, I think misogyny is a big part of it. I spend so much time screaming into the void on Twitter about these issues, and I had a publisher reach out to me and say, instead of putting all this out there for free and just yelling and getting nowhere, have you thought about sort of organizing it and trying to put it into a book? And that was the first time I had really thought about doing that. I think every writer has this, amorphous book that you're going to write someday on the back of their, on their mind, but not really. This was not what I thought my book would be about. But once I started talking to other women and realized how universal these experiences are, I wanted to tell our story, not just my story, but the stories of so many women, a lot of whom are household names, who have been dealing with this sometimes for decades. So I felt like all of us together sort of had something profound to say. Think, for issues, of course, things like equal pay, which are issues, and that was really the impetus for the book, that, issues that are issues for women in sports are not just issues for us, they're issues for women all across the board in America and around the world. And so I wanted to sort of just use sports as a jumping off point to talk about things that affect all of us. Certainly I think equal pay is one. Women just being allowed to exist in a sports space feels like such a radical act. And I've had so many women describe to me, like, just having my job feels like a radical act. And some days it really does. Just going about your job feels like you're sort of, inviting things in, because it is so fraught with toxicity. Um, Lots of issues that we obviously, online harassment an issue, how we go about our jobs without having to wade through 50 feet of garbage, how our employers protect us and being able to do those jobs, sexual harassment from within and without our places of employment, wanting to use your voice on issues that you care about, like sexual assault and domestic violence, without being labeled difficult, because again, you're saying things that people don't want to hear. So there's a ton of issues out there that I think affect women, not only in this industry, but, around the world, like I said. And I was grateful for how many women were willing to share their stories, because I, like, again, if it's just me, then it's like, oh, here's the story of my career and how mean people were to me. Whereas, if you bring some other women in to talk about it, now suddenly people realize, okay, maybe there's a problem here. And when it comes to the way that women exist in sports, there's definitely a problem. Things that give me hope or that make me feel good are, for example, when the US women win the World Cup and the entire stadium starts chanting equal pay, or the other night in the women's NCAA tournament, where it seemed like the entire, all of Twitter was watching UConn versus Baylor. Yeah. Or we have Beth Mowins call a Chicago Cubs game, the first woman to ever do that. I mean, anything we do that normalizes women being in and around sports, I think, is a step in the right direction. I mean, ultimately, I think that the accountability has to fall equally between the powers that be that have the ability to make the decisions to improve people's lives and also the fans that consume it. Because if we look at situations like the NCAA and we look at the disparity in the weight training room that we all saw last week from the NCAA women to the NCAA men, the only reason the NCAA cares about that is because someone put it on social media and people got upset. That's when we see real change. And so when we see, oh, we're debuting a new show and here's four men hosting it or four white guys, even worse, in 2021, it's sort of, how is this still a thing that you have four guys up there who all look the same and no reflection of the diversity of the fan base. And it always sort of amazes me that people just accept it in sports in a way that they wouldn't if it was an academic conference, or if it was, all these ways that people would say, I'm not going to be on a panel that is just like white people, for example. But when it comes to sports, it's like we just accept it. And the only time we really see change is when the fans use their voice to start changing things, either monetarily through boycotts, for example, when a lot of people wouldn't buy NFL merchandise because of Colin Kaepernick's blackballing, or we see shaming on social media like the NCAA got. That is when the powers that be start to care. So, fans have so much more power, I think, than they know. And that is always where I'm hoping that the accountability will start, because they really do have the power to force the people in the positions of decision making to move in the right direction. When I talk about accountability, I mean, another place that we need accountability is in the media outlets themselves. And here's a perfect example. Employers want women and want their reporters, no matter what gender they are, to be on social media, right? They want you to help promote your work, to drive up the audience, to try to get a following. And not only that, you have to be on social media because that is where news is breaking, particularly on Twitter. So teams break trades on Twitter, they break signings on Twitter, all kinds of things. So I can't imagine doing this job without being on Twitter. Yet nobody wants to take the responsibility to protect their reporters. And I think Felicia Somnas at the Washington Post was a great example that after Kobe Bryant's death, all she did was tweet out a story about the sexual assault charges against him. And she got, harassed to the point where she had to leave her home. And flee to a hotel to get away from all the death threats that she was getting. And yet the Washington Post didn't care about that. What they cared about was suspending her because they felt like she was bringing a bad look onto the paper. And that, I think, is such a perfect example of the way that the people who are in charge of media outlets seem to recognize the power of social media for good. They don't recognize the power of it for bad. And it's been true, by and large, has sort of been treated like online harassment for women in sports is our problem to solve. And I know that, when I went to my employer at my radio station and asked for help, I was basically told, if you don't want people to harass you, don't say such controversial things. Well, I'm a sports talk radio host. You hired me to say controversial things. You hired me for my opinion. So I think that this is a problem across the board. And I've spoken with it about many women that work in sports media who have faced the same thing. And, kudos to ESPN, who has basically said to their reporters, if you need help, we will get security involved to help you. And I know several women that have availed themselves of that service when they have, either when you're in the middle of a troll army storm, or when you have a particular harasser who is really upsetting you or, is threatening you. But by and large, we deal with this stuff by ourselves. And you can't have social media policies that say you're not allowed to embarrass the company. If that's the case, then we're going to treat your social media account like it's ours. But when you're in trouble, we're going to treat it like it's yours and it's your problem. And that's unfortunately the way that most media outlets have handled online harassment. One of the things that is so amazing to me about organizations, and the NCAA is a great example, is that they keep falling on their face and they keep being publicly shamed, and then they run and fix everything. And it's kind of amazing to me that there's no one who's like, okay, not this year. Let's sit down before this tournament and figure out what we have for the women, what we have for the men, and where there's inequities and where we can, straighten this out. And it just never happens. I don't know what the reason for that could possibly be, other than women are just valued less than men in this space. And I think you absolutely, if that is your attitude 40 years after Title IX, then you absolutely should be shamed for that. And you should be drug all up and down the internet. And so I think one of the things that is difficult for women is that because there are so few of us in this industry, we don't feel necessarily safe speaking out, right? Especially if you are the only woman in your workplace, like I was when I was in sports talk radio. And, everybody wants people watching sports to feel good, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Like, you play sports, you feel great. You watch sports, you feel great. It's something that we enjoy doing together. Unfortunately, there is a very vocal group out there that wants sports to be nothing other than escapism. And, if you are not part of a very specific demographic, I think it is difficult for sports to be a complete escapism, because you recognize racism when you see it. You recognize, players that have been accused of violence against women. You recognize players who have been accused of being transphobic or homophobic, players who are anti-immigration, whatever it is. It's really difficult to set all of that aside and watch a game. So that is sort of where the powers that be are coming from, though. Everything is happy, everything is great, everything is fun. Please don't remind us of things that aren't fun. And so I think, especially for women, especially when we're talking about issues like online harassment, violence against women, equal pay, these are not issues that anybody wants to talk about or wants you to talk about, because it takes away from the like, yay, sports are fun kind of thing. So I think it's hard to decide that you're going to use your voice. And I was lucky because, I had started writing this book before the pandemic hit. And when it hit, sports talk radio was just decimated across the board. And I was one of the people who lost my job. And suddenly it became much easier to say what I wanted to say, because I didn't have to go to work then and face these people. I didn't have to worry about sports teams telling my station they weren't going to give us this athlete or that athlete to talk to because Julie said something we didn't like, and she's on your station. Therefore, we're punishing your entire station, which is sort of, that access is sort of how they control what gets said about them. Right. So, I feel like I found my voice now. My employer now knew exactly what they were getting when they hired me, which is good. And I think, I've got a track record of pretty much saying what I think. But this is a confidence in my voice that I wish I had found at a much younger age. I think that I hear from a lot of women that, like, it wasn't until I was 40 that I had the confidence to say stuff. And as a result, women do a lot of self-censoring. Because either you don't want to deal with the blowback you're going to get in the form of online harassment. You don't want your boss to get upset with you. You don't want teams to get upset with you. So I think the decision to use your voice is a difficult one, but somehow, talking about it with lots of other women who are having similar experiences felt safer. And I really feel like that's why we haven't had a real Me Too movement in sports either, is because women are so disparate in this industry. We're so spread out. I said at my job many times, I wouldn't see another woman there unless I ran into someone from another station in the bathroom. So how do you then speak up about things that are important to you when you're the only one? My hope is that eventually we get some people in positions of power that are truly committed to inclusion and equity, that understand that we need a sports media that reflects the fan base, and that we are able to speak out about things in a safe place where you don't have to worry about losing your job or being labeled as a difficult person for doing so. I don't know that's going to happen until we have, a sports media that reflects the fan base, or reflects America or Canada or, whatever country, the multi-cultural countries that we are. I don't know that changes. So my hope is that as more women move into the space, as more people of color move into the space, as more Black people move into the space, that eventually we are safe to where we can truly use our voices. But until then, I know that I have more privilege than a lot of people, that I can do it from a place where I feel relatively safe, even if that's not always the case on Twitter. And so I feel a real obligation, not just for the women who came ahead of me, who had to keep their heads down and do their jobs and put up with worse than any of us have had to deal with, but also for the young women coming behind me, who I feel like it's my obligation to hold the door open for, and be honest about what this industry looks like for people. So I'll keep talking until someone shuts me up. So proud and envious of this group coming behind me of young women who are much more confident at a younger age, who I feel like are bolder, who use their voices more, who are much more able to ask for what they want, I think, than I was at that age, for sure. And I've heard that same thing from women in their 30s and their 40s, like, oh, I wish I had the confidence of these young girls today. And there's a couple pieces of advice. Like, one is, ask for what you want. Men do this. Men, go to their bosses and say, hey, I know I'm an update anchor now, but I want to host a show. What do I have to do to get to the point where I can host a show? Whereas women so often are just sort of conditioned that we're just lucky to be here. And especially if you are the only woman there, you feel like your job is precarious, like you're constantly walking a tightrope. But men don't necessarily feel that way about where they are in the industry. So I always tell women, if you want to be a host, if you want to do play by play, whatever, talk about it, tell people, tell everyone, make sure your boss knows. I think that's kind of uncomfortable for us to do, but I think it's something that we really need to learn to do. And the other thing is that, you will never have the kind of allies in men that you have in women. And I've been a long time coming to that. I mean, I went through my cool girl phase where I was sort of like, oh, my best friends are guys. Women are so dramatic, kind of thing. But at the end of the day, the ones who pick you up and dust you off and sort of push you back in the direction you came from are other women in the industry. And unfortunately, because there are so few of us, I think we tend to look at each other as competition sometimes, because there's only going to be one person chosen for this role and everybody wants it to be them. And, what I've found is that the best allies I've had a lot of great male allies, but nothing like the women in this field, who have been there for me, who have listened to me cry, who have cheered me on, who have shared things with me for my book that they didn't tell anyone else and that they were scared about putting out there, but they did it because we were all doing it together. And, lifting while you climb is something that's become very important to me. And there was certainly a time in my life when that was not the case. And in my wish for a younger generation is that they get there much earlier, that they see other women as the allies that they are, rather than someone standing in the way of what they're trying to achieve. Because the truth is, if there are room for all these white guys in sports media, there is more than enough room for all of us. I mean, I think there's just a real ignorance out there a lot of the people that are making the hiring and firing decisions, that people aren't interested in women, aren't interested in women's sports, that women don't know as much about men, that anyone who's not a white male is a risk to put in a situation. I mean, it's born out of ignorance and not just knowing enough different types of people from different backgrounds. And I think that it's really used as gatekeeping. Everyone in sports media is constantly trying to expand their audience. Everybody wants a bigger share. But when it to putting someone on the air who's a little bit different, people are terrified of that, because if it backfires, then it's their fault and nobody wants, that to happen to them. And I think that people that make those decisions don't know enough women, don't know enough people of color, don't know enough members of the LGBTQ plus community. And you tend to hire, or there's something called a mirror complex, where you tend to hire people who look like you, or you tend to gravitate towards people who look like you. And unfortunately, we've got a monolithic culture happening right now in sports talk media, where the number of women is actually shrinking in the industry if you take ESPN out of the mix. Like I said earlier, we still have shows debuting with 4 guys, which I think in 2021 is, 4 or 5 guys is really kind of inexcusable. You need to mix it up with some different types of people in there. And, again, until we get some better educated people in there with more desire for inclusion and diversity and equity across the board, I think we're going to be stuck here for a while.